Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's Microsoft Reactor session on green tech. A few housekeeping notes before we begin, and I turn this over to James and Asim. This session is being recorded and will be shared on our YouTube channel. Live captions are also on, and you can turn those on. I think if you click the three buttons in your top bar, you should be able to turn on live captions and follow along. First things first, please check into the live stream. If you can all see my screen, there's a link and an event ID. The link is aka.ms/reactor check-in. The event ID is 13443. Really, all that really helps with is that any event resources that are shared in today's live stream, any links or slides, they're all available once you check in there. It'll give you links to everything, so that really helps. Next slide. And I can put that in the chat as well if you'd like. So today's session is all about what is green tech and green software development. I'll let James and Asim talk about that, so we'll skip this slide. But what I really want to talk about is our code of conduct. So I'll leave the slide up for a bit. Please take a look, read through it. We just want to make sure you're being aware of others, being friendly, especially in the chat. Be welcome, respectful, and understanding. Just, have a good time in the chat or anything if you're chatting around. Just be respectful of the folks that are also here. And without further ado, here's Asim. I'll let him introduce himself, but Asim is a developer and an author and a speaker with over 20 years of experience working with the Space Agency, Google, Microsoft, and at Microsoft currently he is a Green Cloud Advocacy Lead. He's also the co-organizer of climateaction.tech and a host on the climatefix.com podcast. And that's it for me. So that's all for housekeeping notes. If you have any questions, please leave them in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eamon, for hosting that. So my name is James Willard, everyone. I look after the Reactor program across Europe and the Middle East. My pronouns are he and him. And I'm super excited to be joined by Asim today. So we are going to be running this as a bit of a Q&A conversation format. Please do feel free to drop any questions in the chat as we go through. We'll be pretty kind of free-flowing in this one. So if you have anything which you'd like to ask Asim, then definitely drop that in and we will keep an eye on that throughout. So Asim, do you want to add any more to your introduction around kind of your background or your kind of current role? It sounded very impressive.
So everybody's role sounds a lot more impressive than it is, isn't it? But so the role, so I work in the developer relations division. So our organization is all about connecting with engineers and developers all over the world. A large part of our role is, as you know, kind of like teaching, education, but also kind of product feedback, really trying to understand from communities what are the products, services, tools that they need, and connecting that back to kind of the product teams at Microsoft and trying our hardest to make the platforms and stuff we build the kind of platforms and that kind of those developer communities really love to use. We have like multiple different teams inside the developer relation, inside the cloud advocacy division. So there's ones that focus in on different technologies like .NET, Java. We have teams that focus in on different types of communities, like the machine learning community or the startups community or the academic community. And kind of what my focus there is green. So like it's also just essentially talking to the green community of technologists out there in the world, such as kind of finding out kind of what are the tools, what are the things that they care about, what do they need to know, how do you build green applications and the like. So that's kind of my intro to my role.
Cool.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. That sounds good. I'm sure we will hear a bit more about that as we get into it. Maybe a good opener. So I'm assuming if we're talking about green tech, then the overarching issue is climate change. So when we talk about climate change in this kind of setting, or from your perspective, how would you define exactly what that is?
So it's kind of like there's a huge there's obviously a huge amount to that, and I think the important thing that I state is that climate's always changing. It's been changing for 100,000 years, for millions of years. It will always be changing from this point forward. The challenge we have right now is that climate's changing too fast, and it's too fast for animals, plants, and humanity to adapt to. When we actually talk about kind of the climate community and climate scientists and kind of what we're doing, there's two areas. There's mitigation and adaptation. So mitigation is kind of how do we pump the brakes on a little bit, to slow things down so that we can adapt faster, because that's really the problem is it's happening so fast that we can't adapt to it. Unfortunately, that whole adaptation thing, that whole conversation is mostly about how will humans adapt to it. We don't really there's no really like plans on how to like help dolphins adapt to it or anything. So it's always a question of like how do humans adapt to it, which is unfortunate. But mitigation is all about how do you kind of reduce the impact of climate change, which is essentially just greenhouse gases are going into our atmosphere. They're warming up the planet. It acts as a blanket. It's a very natural phenomenon. You need some greenhouse gases in our atmosphere, otherwise we'd be far too cold. But we just have too much created from human activities, and it's warming up the planet, and that's essentially what's called climate change. And really, the root cause of the problem is quite simply, like I do on my podcast, like Climate Fix podcast, I interview different people, and I interviewed a founder of a startup in the US called Nori. And I ask every single founder kind of what is the problem that you're solving? That's one of my first questions on the podcast. And I even give like really complex answers to that kind of question. You can make, to explain yourself and your role and what it is that you fit. But he gave the most succinct answer I'd ever heard, which is there's just too much carbon in our atmosphere and we need less of it. And I was like, okay, how many millions of dollars are you asking for from investors? And that's kind of your pitch line. But that's basically it. At the end of the day, that's the root of our problem. There's just too much carbon in our atmosphere, and we need to reduce it. The heating aspect that we have right now is it's caused a 1 degree temperature increase over pre-industrial times. If you look at the science behind it, like it's a significant change, the 1.5 degree average change. We're more in line to like a 3.5, 4 degree change by the end of the century. But in order to kind of get down to, we all agreed in kind of 2016 in the Paris Climate Agreement, to try and do things to get things to reduce the increase to just 1.5%. And that's really what we're all trying to achieve.
Okay. So there's a few phrases and kind of terms out there which I think different companies and businesses and kind of individuals are using when they talk about the impact they're trying to make when it comes to climate change. So can you help distill and explain the difference on some of those? So ones that spring to mind include net zero, carbon neutral, and carbon negative.
Yeah.
Are they all the same thing? Are they corporates playing around with words to avoid making a real impact, or how do they kind of play out against each other?
Yeah. Well, I think that the truth is that they are, well, at one level there are kind of definitions of these things that people have generated, and the Science Based Targets Institute is a great institution that kind of goes, well, you've now used this term. Let me tell you what this term actually means through science. There is and then I want to be absolutely truthful and honest. I've seen organizations even say, "Oh, we are X according to the Science Based Targets Institute's definition of X," and when you read what they've done, it's very kind of a limited. It's not quite matching to that. So carbon neutral is probably the first one I'll aim for. It's actually got a really poor definition. So when we talk about the carbon emissions of a company, there's a carbon accounting mechanism called the GHG protocol, greenhouse gas protocol, which is just a way of how does almost like an accounting, like a monetary accounting protocol. It's like how do you actually account for the carbon emissions of your company? And you basically sum everything up into 3 categories: scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And scope 1 is kind of how many tons of carbon are you responsible for emitting from actually burning stuff. So like, let's say you had like a diesel engine, like how much have you actually burned and to emit into the atmosphere? And scope 2 is how much you have emitted indirectly through the use of electricity. So electricity, we all use electricity. Most electricity is still created through the burning of fossil fuels. So you add all of that up and you estimate and you come to your scope 2. And your scope 3 is what's called your value chain, which is kind of everything that all the carbon emissions that were emitted to create the things that you sell, and then all of the carbon emissions that people emit through the use of your items. So an example of that is an Xbox. So an Xbox, like all the carbon emissions for all the little parts of an Xbox, add up to your scope 3. Then when someone takes that Xbox home and plugs it into the electricity, it's all the carbon emissions from the electricity they use. That's a scope 3. Carbon neutral is a term, and the EPA, the US EPA has a definition of what it actually. They have their definition of carbon neutral, which is you have offset all of your scope 1 and your scope 2, and kind of like however much of your scope 3 that you really think you want to. It's kind of like do your big ones. It's up to you. And so and they don't really specify strongly like what kind of offset do you use? How there's no real kind of like it's a lot is left for interpretation. And so one of the what was I going to say? One of the what was I? So carbon neutral. So what Microsoft for long since 2012 we were carbon neutral, which was we offset all of our scope 1 and all of our scope 2, and actually all of our flights for every single employee was offset on scope 3. However, we used a type of offset where we weren't so strict on our use of the type of offsets. Then we used something called we used lots of different types of offsets, but one of the offsets we used was something called a carbon avoidance offset. And a carbon avoidance offset is something along the lines of, or can be, it's not always, but can be something along the lines of, I've got this forest, I was thinking of chopping it down, but if you give me some money, I won't chop it down. And what we'll do is we'll call that an offset. And that's a very rough and ready kind of like, there's lots of different edge cases for that. Like for instance, there's other companies, and what they do is they go around and they find old refrigerant that would just leak out into the atmosphere, old fridges, and they make sure that refrigerant is kind of like, but that's actually carbon avoidance, not carbon. And what we now do is we make a distinction between carbon avoidance, carbon removal, because carbon avoidance is like, I'm going to stop more carbon from being emitted into the atmosphere.
Yeah.
What we now do, and one of this new term called net zero came along, which is like, well, look, carbon neutral just isn't good enough. We need a stronger kind of thing. And because the problem is this, there's too much carbon in our atmosphere. So for every gram of carbon for every molecule that you kind of push out there through anything, you need to grab that molecule and put it back into the ground. And that's the net zero terminology. And what that means is essentially you can't really, it's hard to use then carbon avoidance. You have to use what's called carbon removal, which means that Microsoft now, all that we do is we only buy carbon removal offsets. And these are offsets which we know that offset is going to take carbon, put it in the ground. We don't have like there's investment in kind of like future things. There's a white paper that we've got, which I know, Brandon, I think you're asking questions in the chat. I recommend to find out a lot of details regarding what Microsoft's, exactly what we do and exactly our thinking regarding carbon removals. There's a white paper written by our Chief Environmental Officer, Lucas Jopper, and I don't know what her title is now, but she's responsible for all of our carbon purchases. And I always, oh my God, this is going to be awful, because I always get her mixed up with the presidential candidate. I want to say Elizabeth Warren, but it's wrong. But anyway, it's close, and I really hope she doesn't watch this. I really hope she watches this, but I really hope she doesn't watch this. But it's called a carbon removal white paper by Microsoft, and Brandon, you'll get a
I'll see if I can dig it out and drop it in the chat.
Yeah, do dig out and drop it in the chat, because a lot of the carbon removals that we're doing right now are nature-based carbon removals. So we're still doing a lot of stuff regarding not just tree planting, but things like that. But like the mechanical means, look, we can achieve a hell middle of a lot right now. There's plenty of headroom for kind of carbon removals. The kind of direct air capture, which is kind of the stuff that Brandon's asking about, is technology that we'll probably need in 2030, 2040, but we need to put the investment in that right now to get the price low enough. So investment does need to go into that, but it's not like the primary mechanism right now. Like there's way more opportunities and kind of technologies that we can use right now. But basically, that's essentially net zero. Net zero, actually, the Science Based Targets Institute specific definition of net zero is this. They make a distinction between abatement and neutralization. So what you can't be to say net zero is you can't, to be net zero, you can't say, all right, we're doing nothing, we're changing nothing, and we're just going to buy a whole carbon removal offsets as like just like wipe our conscious clean, our feelings clean. To be net zero, you actually have to put as much effort as you can into actually reducing your emissions, and then only when you absolutely can't do any more do you buy removal offsets, and that's kind of what net zero a net zero commitment is, and that's actually what Microsoft has committed to as of last year, is net zero with carbon removal offsets. And in fact, we bought the entire market for carbon removal offsets last year, and that was the intention. The intention was we need to get super strict on what our definition of offsets are. That reduced the universe of offsets that we could buy, and then we have basically completely bought that market, and therefore we're now creating the market for more of these offsets. That's what basically our intention was to kind of like use our money to create a market in the type of offsets which we need. Super long explanation, but yeah.
Long but detailed. It's good. So my understanding was that Microsoft's commitment was around being carbon negative.
Yeah.
Is that different to net zero, or is that the same thing? And I think the commitment is by 2030. Is that right?
Yeah. So if you think about if net zero is just make sure that you're taking down more molecules than you're emitting, to be carbon negative is like, as long as you take down one more molecule than you've emitted, you're negative. So it's like I think it's a great headline, but like the thing that's buried in our headline is, and the thing that's much harder to do is our goal is to reduce our emissions by 50%, not just to offset all of our emissions from today, but reduce it by 50%, and then kind of offset even more to become negative. What gets confusing in the world is that I keep thinking because IKEA have a sustainability statement that says climate positive, and Microsoft has a sustainability statement that says carbon negative. Right. So then it gets kind of a bit confusing, because you have to like flip it around your head. But they just mean climate positive, like we just want to be positive for climate. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, we'll move on a little bit. So let's think a little bit more about your role. So you're looking at green tech, green sustainable development, if that's the right phrase. So I guess from a kind of thinking about it from a like software perspective, what area are you looking at, and how are kind of developers, I guess, able to start to influence some of these things?
Yeah. So when I talk about like what our company has to do, and also what like when we say Microsoft is trying to reduce 50% of our emissions by 2030, we're not doing that kind of on our own. That is like what our countries have agreed to do in the Paris. That's what everybody has kind of agreed to do, is reduce emissions of 50%, and that has to happen across the board, like every industry, every sector, whether you're suddenly can't think of anything, a farmer or a coffee producer, I don't know, or an engineer, a hardware engineer, or a software engineer. Like everybody has to do the 50%. So my focus is like, what do software engineers, what's a software engineer? What is it that software engineers can do? Because we all have a part to play. what does a software engineer can do to kind of help reduce their emissions? And it's unfortunate area that not a lot of people, there's been not a lot of research in the tech space. There's been a lot of research into kind of how do we make our hardware more efficient? How do we make our data centers more efficient? How do a lot of these things more efficient? But software is not an angle that's really been tackled before. There's very few books. This is just one of them. There's like 3 books in its entirety on software sustainability, and they're all on the web. Actually, they're all on the web development. And so that's what we realize is there needs to be a lot of advice for software engineers. We started creating what's called some training on the subject. The first thing we created was something called the Principles of Sustainable Software Engineering, or Green Software Engineering. And the thing we kind of realized early on, I tell you where I was thinking earlier on when I first started this role was I was like, oh, we just need to create the checklist. Let me just speak to as many people as I can. I'll create the 12-point checklist. As long as you can tick off the 12-point checklist in every single software, you're green. And after dozens, hundreds of conversations with people, I realized that I'm really not talking about checklist. I'm talking about an entire discipline of computing. Because the advice is vastly different whether you're in machine learning, whether you're web, depending on what aspect of web you're in, depending on what aspect of machine learning you're in. Like the advice is deeply contextual as well, depending on exactly what you're building. 2 different apps might have 2 different approaches to make them emit less carbon. So it's kind of an entire field of computing that we're now calling green software engineering. And you have to kind of know a bunch of different you have to know a bunch of things which are just not taught anyway, just not taught. And the first things the first principle we talk about is carbon. So when this whole field was just beginning, very, very early stages, because we just called it green software engineering, you speak to people and I speak to people and I'd realize, oh my word, your definition of green and my definition of green are 2 totally different definitions of green. So I'm trying to optimize for X and you're trying to optimize for Y. Yeah. So for me, kind of what we all narrowed down to just talking about it from carbon. Because from Microsoft perspective, when we talk about sustainability, it's on 4 pillars: carbon, waste, water, and ecosystems. So protecting biodiversity is what I mean when I say ecosystems. To certain people inside Microsoft, like there's certain people who all they really care about is protecting biodiversity. That's their number 1 priority and goal in life. So when they're talking about green software, they're thinking, well, how can we build software that just in such a way protects biodiversity, and water is another one. So and the United Nations has 17 sustainable development goals. So it's kind of like there's too many variables. So what we decided to focus in on is just carbon. So that's the first principle is as you're building applications, build applications that as you're trying to evaluate options for how you build an application, you try and look at it from which of these 2 choices emits the most carbon, and then we'll pick the other choice. And if you go through the principles, you can see there's a bunch of different advice for people to take. So for instance, it explains about electricity and how electricity is a source of carbon. It explains about this concept called embodied carbon, this concept called carbon intensity. You have to learn a lot more about how electricity works. I'm actually surprised. I still think it's surprising how I'm hearing an echo. I still think it's surprising how I didn't know how sorry, that was really distracting me for a second. How I didn't know anything about electricity at all. Like my entire job, everything I do depends on electricity. And I don't know how it works. I don't know how it functions. I don't know how my laptop uses it. I don't know how it's made. I don't know how it's transported. So you have to learn a lot about electricity. Yeah, so that's kind of one of the things we're talking on. There's a couple of questions. I'm just going to quickly answer them in the chat for all this. So again, from Brandon, do you plan on collaborating this with other companies? Yes, we are actually launching a foundation next week called the Green Software Foundation, and with a number of other partners, and announcements should come out shortly. But like one of the things and it's a non-profit foundation that is managed by the Linux Foundation, and kind of one of the things we're hoping to well, it's a vehicle for collaboration. You need a vehicle like a foundation to collaborate between companies, and B, one of the things you're going to be working on is standards and best practices for software development, things that are vendor neutral, not just Microsoft, and the like. So yeah, they'll be coming. The only training that we have right now is the training for the I'll post it later, so I'll learn module. That's the only other kind of training that we have. We don't have a checklist. There is no checklist because we realized the checklist is too simple. There's training, and you take the training. Once you've got the training, you then evaluate this training in the context of your specific application, and you can maybe point you in the right direction for how to make your application a bit greener. Our intention in the future is to get down to a really specific level of training. So if you're a web developer, we'll tell you exactly what you need to do to make your web applications carbon efficient. If you're a machine learning engineer, we'll tell you exactly what you need to do to make your machine learning models efficient. But we're quite away from there because, as I said before, we're creating an entire field of computing. So a lot of material needs to get created. Some of the stuff we're talking about needs a lot more academic research to figure it out.
What sort of impact do you think like this element will have? So thinking about the software development aspect in comparison to like, the core business of some organizations that, their bread and butter may be like a huge like carbon generating monster. What sort of impact do you think? Like how does it sit on the scale? Like I'm assuming it's a worthwhile exercise, but how do you approach it from that sense?
Yeah. So there's two stats that I give people that I think are quite interesting. And the first one's from a cloud perspective, which is that it's just from the Uptime Institute, which is the average server utilization across the world is 15%, 15. So it's a surprising fact that most servers are actually idle. Like Microsoft is not 15%. We don't run our servers at 50% capacity. I'll tell you that right now. But like a lot of people out there do, and it kind of averages out to 15%. And I think that's one really interesting stat that shows you the potential upside of software, because really you can increase 15% to 30% quite easily. You can increase 30% to 60% quite easily. Oh, sorry, my alarm's going. And so there's quite a lot of upside potential there. There's also upside potential in kind of hardware improvements to improve efficiencies, but we're not really looking at we're looking at small percentage improvements there. We're not really looking at 100, 200, 300, 400% improvements is what you could achieve through software. The other angle I'd say, oh, so I forgot to give you the main statistics. So like in terms of the ICT industry, there's various numbers. I think that the one that I'm quite comfortable talking right now is the one from I forgot the name of the article. It's about 3 to 8% is the projected growth of emissions from software from ICT, the whole ICT industry by 2040, depending on growth, depending on a bunch of different things. Now, 3 to 8% might not sound like a lot. I think the entirety of the transportation sector, everything is 15%, 15. So it's a significant aspect of that. But I think the thing that's most interesting about it is when you look at the number of people who can have an impact on that. So, for instance, the entire transportation sector, you're looking at, how many billions of people are on the planet needs to make a choice for that to change. If you're looking at the software sector, there's 30 million software developers in the world.
Right.
So as a lever, as a lever to pull, we can convince 30 million people that it has a potential impact of 8% on emissions. And really, we don't even really need to convince 30 million people, developers. I use a number of 1 million. We need to go away and convince 1 million developers to change how they do things. And if we can do that, we can have a significant impact on the carbon emissions. And that's when we look at kind of how do we decarbonize the planet. You don't look at kind of what is the sector that is the biggest emissions and just go for it. You look at what is the thing that we can do now that has the maximum impact. So for instance, like planes and all this other stuff, like planes, look, they're important, they're hard, but like we also all know they're going to be the hardest thing to decarbonize. So we probably aren't going to do it the first thing. We aim for the things that are kind of easier to decarbonize now. Electricity grids right now are kind of relatively much easier to decarbonize than kind of a lot of other things out there. So it's as a path to decarbonization, I think software is one of the things we look at right now.
What has the journey been, I guess, in this field over the last kind of recent years? And I'm conscious we've only just at the beginning of the journey, but kind of like where have we been since you've started this field, and then where do you hope to kind of get to within like 12 months or 24 months?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting journey, and it is kind of a very, very, very new field. I'd say like 5 years ago, there were like just a handful of academics in the world that were even like kind of asking these questions. 18 months ago, you could say I probably knew everybody who was like looking at this field through some sort of connection or whatever. Until now, it's kind of what's really exciting is that we've just been discovering that there's like been quite significant investment by companies. Like Microsoft is investing. We've got like a body of people internally, thought leaders, kind of really looking at the space. Then we kind of discovered, there's an R&D team in Accenture, quite a big one, that's kind of looking at green software. There's people at ThoughtWorks who are looking at green software. I spoke at the Goldman Sachs Green Software Engineering internal working group 2-3 weeks ago. So there's kind of like a number of organizations now that are really starting to invest in this stuff. They're really starting to see the distinction between not just kind of like IT. That everybody would always call it green IT in general. It'd be just like this blanket term, and now they're starting to recognize the difference between software and hardware in those equations. So now that the software angle is really starting to see. As I said, like moving onwards to the future is like I'd say I mentioned before that the foundation is a large part of what we think is going to really galvanize and help galvanize this whole industry moving forward. Really excited about that. We've got some really strong industry players with us. We've got really strong non-profits who are joining us. We've got some really strong academics who are joining us. Membership's open, so anybody else can join us as well if they want. But that's going to be the thing that really galvanizes a lot of this stuff. The thing that we've seen, and I've seen especially, is seen especially is that I've lost track for a second. What was the question? I've kind of lost track. There's a couple of things on the screen.
We were thinking about like the potential, like in a couple of years' time, like where things are heading.
I think that the thing that I'm really, really, really interested in and kind of and I think the biggest lever we could pull in this industry is policy. And it's a thing that time and time again it kind of comes back down to because there's two things we look at from the foundation perspective, like standards. We need standards that people can follow. But what is a standard? A standard is something that a company voluntarily adopts, right? It just voluntarily adopts the standard. A policy is a standard that's mandatory, right? Government policy. So that's kind of one of the things that I keep a very close eye on kind of any hints of a policy coming along in the space. I'm willing. I'll put money down with anybody. The first policy on kind of green software is going to come from France. I'll just put money down on it. There's so many hints that's just going to come from there. We've seen like little hints. There's two things that happened last year. First was an Article 20 law proposal, which if it gets passed, it can be interpreted to ban infinite scroll. Infinite scroll on the just doom scrolling, ban doom scrolling. Yeah. But yeah, I'm not too sure how much of that proposal was informed by science and how much it was informed by politics, to be honest with you. Yeah. There's another proposal. We've also seen some interesting tweets from Macron, President Macron, recently, where he's been asking about wouldn't it be good if every application had to report how much carbon its carbon intensity? So imagine like a Word had to tell you how many grams of carbon are emitted for every character you write, or if Teams had to report how many grams of carbon for every minute of
That's
things. So that
so
we think there's some policy coming in the future. And that's really what I think is when I look at this space. I think that's really what's going to happen. And I think once that happens, it's going to as soon as there's a policy, suddenly everybody's going to want to know everything want to know about green software engineering. Suddenly every company is going to want to hire a green software engineer. Suddenly, I think that's going to be the tipping point for this field, and then everybody needs to undergo green software engineering. Yeah.
I think that's interesting, because I think companies and individuals are guided by government and legislation and things like that. So that's obviously going to have an impact. And actually, so John Kerry, who's the US climate envoy, he was doing some like breakfast TV in the UK at the weekend. I don't know if you saw that. And he said something quite interesting. So he said that 50% of the reductions that the US needs to make to get to close to their zero emissions target, which is by 2050, I think, will come from technologies which we don't know what they are yet. So they're banking on there being some advances in different fields that we don't even kind of understand like where that may come from yet. Do you have with your crystal ball any insights as to kind of what fields they may be? I mean, someone's referenced quantum in the chat. That's come from Brandon. Like, what type of areas are there where there could be, dramatic or exponential kind of advancement in technology that could actually make a really, really big difference?
Yeah. Before I answer this question, I will caveat it. The politicians love to say that what we're waiting for is technology. And everybody else is saying, we've got the technology. All we're waiting for is politicians to enact policy to implement them. So I think there's kind of like the two things. So yeah, so I will argue that we have the technology right now to kind of like meet our 2030 targets. I think what he's talking about is to meet kind of the bigger target. So there's two targets. There's one target is we've got to get to 50% reduction by 2030, and then we've got to get to zero by 2050. To get to 50% reduction by 2030, we can actually do that with existing technologies. We can do that. The plan is the options and pathways to get to that get used year by year by year. But right now, there's still a chance if we just kind of, when I say there's still a chance, I mean it would need a big change, but there's still an actual theoretically possible chance of it reaching it by just kind of decarbonizing our electricity at an incredible rate that no one is doing right now. So that's one of them. But to get to kind of the next level of technological improvements, it's across the board. So because it's across the whole sectors. When it comes to transportation, we're really talking about electric vehicles, and we're really talking about growing electric vehicle fleet. But the secret to the electric vehicle solution isn't that we replace every single petrol-powered car with an electric car. It's that we replace the how many 1 or 2 billion cars there are in the world with 100 million cars that are self-driving, that roam around. No one owns their own car, and we just have like a much smaller car fleet. We reduce the kind of embodied emissions of that. So that's kind of one of the big tactics there. From the food production angle, we really need to kind of move away from meat as a produce. It's incredibly carbon intensive. There's some amazing companies out there who are just doing some fantastic work. So, Impossible Foods, Beyond Meat, a number of other Ecovative, a number of other areas. There's a ton of research into fungus. I'm a massive fan of fungus, so I grow. I'm a little amateur mycologist, so I'm growing lots of. This is actually all mushrooms growing behind me and down there as well. So I think a large part of our future is going to be a fungus related, one form or the other. A lot of these meat replacements are well, fungal replacements.
Insects. What about insects? They're on the radar, aren't they?
Insects.
Yeah.
Insects.
Yeah.
I've not heard the insects one. What's that one? Is that the?
Well, as a kind of food replacement, I think that's the most sustainable one. Yeah.
Yeah. Potentially as a meat source. Yeah. Crickets. Yeah. And they're actually I find them quite tasty these days. Not just insects, but all kinds of meat replacements. I think that's a big one. Transportation is, as I said before, that's big. What were the other big ones? Energy is the big one as well. Eventually, we're going to have to get to, but there's no solution out there where we don't really have to massively accelerate the extraction of carbon from our atmosphere and putting it back into the ground. So then we're looking at other solutions like direct air capture, which is literally just can you suck carbon from the atmosphere and just put it somewhere. Interestingly, one of the best places you can stick carbon that you got from the atmosphere is back into exactly the same holes where you pump the oil from. So you just literally pump it down the same holes. So yeah, interesting. So you wonder who we're going to pay to do that. Then and there are companies out there that are taking some of the direct air capture stuff and kind of exploring, well, can you turn that into fuels? There's companies out there looking, can we turn that into like biofuels? And construction is a huge source of emissions. Just concrete, the creation of concrete and the curing of concrete, if I remember rightly, is about currently 8% of global world emissions. 8% is just concrete. So there's lots of stuff being looked at right now. There's actually a firm which has a concrete. There's a firm in the UK which does IoT with concrete. So that one of the things that you can do to reduce the emissions of concrete is somehow knowing exactly when it's at a certain hardness, and then you go into the next step. If you can do that at the right time, you reduce its emissions. There's other stuff that Bill Gates has invested in a concrete firm that it's a special type of concrete that actually sucks carbon from the atmosphere as it cures. So that's another one. And in fact, a really fascinating statistic that I found the other day, which I thought was quite compelling, and it really explains kind of how much humanity has affected the Earth, is that about 2-3 months ago, we reached the tipping point where humans had created more man-made mass on the planet than all living organisms that exist. If that makes sense. Wow. We actually have now made more kind of probably concrete things than living matter that exists on the planet, which kind of gives you an idea of the scale of our construction, which is just incredible. But yeah, the technology's everywhere. Like, we need to use technology for a lot of this stuff. It's just difficult to know exactly. Yeah.
What about thinking about it from like a startup or kind of like a new business venture perspective? Like, what incentives are there like for startups or other companies to kind of explore technologies in this space? And are there any areas which you've seen which are particularly hot at the moment, where they're kind of like things are growing quickly, or anything like that?
There's two. I think the kind of, I know from like a tech investment perspective, and I'm a big believer in kind of investment in technology, because we need, you need a lot of money to flow into this to
Yeah.
counter the existing money in the space. You need a lot of money to flow in the space. So it's good that there are financial incentives for this stuff. The big ones, yes, I've seen Jennifer. I'm big into that micro remediation. So using kind of fungi and microorganisms to break down garbage. In fact, there's a company in the UK which does which there's several companies actually. One in Finland, which uses fungi to break down PCBs. So like it breaks down PCBs and extracts out the waste material and also extracts out the gold and the other parts of it for reuse. There's lots for that. I've forgotten your question again. Oh my god, I'm so sorry.
So no, it's fine. So it's like thinking about new business opportunities, like areas startups could look at, kind of
the areas I know personally that get quite a lot of interest from investors is areas that don't require a lot of capital expenditure. So for instance, anything to do with machine learning and AI, where you theoretically can solve a climate problem with just kind of technology on your computer, and your laptop, where you scale up via some other mechanism. Those kinds of ideas get a lot of interest from venture capitalists, because from their perspective they can see they don't want their money locked up in 40 warehouses full of equipment, industrial machinery, things like that. So those get a lot of attention. There's lots of startups that do really interesting stuff there. There's startups that use kind of satellite imagery to detect methane leaks. There's startups that do a lot of startups with satellite imagery. A lot of startups who look at satellite imagery to help figure out what's actually going on the planet. There's a startup that does a really interestingly kind of risk management. Just kind of, I never really thought about it from that perspective. But like, if you're a company and you've got assets in a part of the world which is going to be affected by climate change in a way that's going to put risk to your company, companies aren't aware of that. And so what they're doing is they're, through kind of a lot of machine learning and modeling, they are making companies aware of the fact that they have a risk on climate. And if companies are aware of the fact they've got a risk on climate, they'll invest more in helping to combat it. If countries are going to lose a lot of investment in their area because those countries are at risk of climate change, those countries are going to. So there's kind of lots of interest that they're getting a lot of interest, because that's also just like it's not the capital expenditure is low and it's a lot more a data problem. So there's a lot of interest in that space. Saying that, there's also a lot of people doing some really fascinating stuff. That just there's another company I'm going to forget their name. They're helping cities. They're helping cities kind of understand, well, what is the carbon impact of your city? How do you reduce the carbon impact? They're putting sensors all over the city and IoTing them up so they can see real time, like, what are the carbon emissions of a city? They can then see, like, well, if we were to change the policy of parking in this neighborhood, how does it actually affect the carbon emissions? Before, they would never even know. It's just guessing. But now they essentially hire this company to help figure out, well, like, now we'll know tomorrow if we change our policy, like, what's the carbon emissions are. So lots of things that is getting a lot of investment. But most importantly, just do whatever you're passionate in is probably the most important one. There's another one, SolarSack. I love this company called SolarSack. They're based out of one of the Nordics. I can't remember. And it's a bag of water. It's basically a plastic bag. The special material is made of a special material where you can put water in, and then you let it sit out in the sun for a few hours, and it decontaminates the water to make it safe for drinking.
Oh, wow.
And it's complete opposite. It's a complete opposite business model. It's going to have high capital expenditure, but it's such a wonderful idea. It's kind of a lot of patenting and research. Like the plastic material is a special one where it lets just the rays of UV, the frequency of light in. And so there's lots of stuff out there. There's lots of interest. Yeah, just do what you're passionate about.
Interesting. I'm conscious of time. I'll do a shout out if anyone has got any last questions for Sim. If you want to drop them in the chat now, we've got a few minutes I can put them to him. If not, then maybe if there are people listening today, if there were kind of like 3 actions or tasks you could give them that you would like them to go away and do to kind of help them on their green tech journey, what are the 3 most important things you think people should do for starters?
If the first one I'd always say is, because I'm also, as I think we mentioned at the start, I'm also co-organizer of a community called climateaction.tech.
Yeah.
I'll paste it in here. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I recommend honestly going to join that community. Like our focus and goal is just to connect people. A lot of people, when they wake up to this issue, especially during COVID times, there's not been opportunities to have meetups. It's kind of, how do you connect with people? You can sometimes feel alone and frustrated and what's going on. So if you go to Climate Action Tech, you'll just find a lot of other. We're 4,000 odd people now, and from all over, and all different roles. If you work for a tech company in any capacity, you're welcome. Well, you're welcome whatever you are, but if you don't work for a tech company, you might not find it so useful. But if you work from any capacity in a tech company, you're welcome. And then there's lots of different communities inside there. You'll find people, like-minded people, and you can connect and talk and join. So that's the first thing I'd recommend. The second thing I recommend is reading or trying out our Learn module, which is aka.ms/SSE. Let me type it here. Learn. And that's kind of the Learn module. That's kind of a half-hour training. It'll get you up to speed on green software engineering. It'll get you to understand the terms. The intention for this is like share it far as wide as possible, because the first and most important thing that we need to do is start talking the same language. And so when I say the word green, I need you to have the same meaning in your head. When I use the word carbon intensity, I need you to know what carbon intensity means. So it kind of helps us really get to it's both. From answering Nicole in the question, understanding the terms on the sustainability side of the tech side. It's the common. It's the terms that kind of match both of them. So that learning does not teach you about sustainability in general at all. It teaches you about sustainability things you need to know when it comes to technology. And the other one is we have a blog as well, which I recommend reading also from a tech perspective.
I've put details of the blogs already.
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Actually, they are to get access to those. I've put those behind the check-in page.
Okay.
And then you can go and get links.
Yep. Sorry. Yeah. Go check. There's a blog also, and kind of go read that. It's a blog on the Microsoft site. It's got a whole bunch of different people at Microsoft who are thinking for sustainability, and it's got lots of really interesting articles on it. People who tried. We've got one person, Pierre, who worked with the VLC. You know, VLC, the media player on most of us, a lot of us use. How he worked with that organization to help reduce the carbon emissions of VLC. He's got examples. I've written stuff on there about energy markets. Other people have written stuff on there about container solutions, all sorts of different use cases. And you might get inspired by something that's been written on there.
Awesome. Okay, I don't think we have any more questions. So I think, unless there's any more final parting words, Asim, I think we can wrap it there. Thank you. That's been really informative. Thank you everyone who's engaged in the chat as well. It's great to those comments and stuff coming through. Lots to learn. We do have, so this is part of a series of events. So this is the first one. We have, I think, at least another 4 events coming up at the same time every week. Next week, I believe we're meeting the winners of a recent climate hackathon that we did. And then after that, we're going to be getting into some more kind of hands-on training. So if you are a software developer and you want to see some of this stuff in action, we've got some kind of hands-on sessions. So today, I guess, was designed to give you a bit of a broad overview, but we're going to be getting a little bit deeper into kind of some of the technical aspects there. So watch out for that. You'll be able to see that all on the series link. So yeah, we've posted all of those resources that we've referenced through on the check-in page. So if you just click through, you should be able to get everything. So thank you for joining, everyone, and thank you, Asim, for sharing. Super interesting.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
It's a cool space. Let's see where we are. We should regroup in 2030 and see if you've see how we're tracking.
Hold me to my promise. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Brilliant.
Right. Thanks, James.
Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.